the dark forms that takes throughout human history, recent human history, is something I'd love to talk to you a bit about. The dark forms that takes.
We can go back to the beginning of
recent
the
human
20th century.
history is
On
something I'd love
the
to
German
talk to you
side,
a
you
bit
described
about.
how
The dark
secret
forms that
societies
takes
like can go back to the beginning of
the
the
foundation
foundation
of
of
Nazi
ideology.
something I'd love
The
to talk to you
German,
a
you
bit
described
about.
how
Dark
secret
forms that
societies
takes
like can go back to the beginning of the foundation of Nazi ideology.
Well, I guess we could start with
you described how secret societies like.
So the Thule Society was a small German occult society. That is, they study metaphysics. A small occultism. German occult that appeared in Munich around 1917, 1918. The key figure behind it was a German esotericist by the name of Rudolf von Zebotendorf. Okay, not his real name. His real name was Adam Rudolf Glauer. He was adopted by a German nobleman and got the name von Zebotendorf. And I like to say that name. So I have this real thing about vague, mysterious characters who show up and do things. And trying to figure out who these people are. So we're working up in the years sort of prior to the First World War. So the decade or so prior to World War I, spends a lot of time in the Ottoman Empire. Turkey was known in the Ottoman Empire, which was a fairly tumultuous place because in 1908 and 1909 there was the Young Turk Revolution. And you had a kind of military coup which effectively overthrew the Ottoman Sultan and installed a military junta, which would go on during the First World War to make its greatest achievement in the Armenian genocide. Eventually, he created a genocidal military regime, which would lead the country into a disastrous First World War, which would destroy the Ottoman Empire, out of which modern Turkey emerges. Yada, yada, yada.
And by the way, we should take a tiny tangent here, which is that you refer to the intelligence agencies as being exceptionally successful. And here in the case of the Young Turks being also very successful in doing the genocide, meaning they've achieved the greatest impact, even though the impact on the scale of good to evil tends towards evil.
It's one of those things that often comes out of revolutionary situations. Revolutions always seek to make things better, don't they? We're going to take a bad old regime. The Sultan is, and the Sultan was bad. I think it's fairly safe that Abdul Hamid II was not wasn't called a Red Sultan because of his favorite color type of thing. And the idea is that they were going to improve. They were now going to, the Ottoman Empire was a multinational empire. They were going to try to equalize and bring in the different groups, and none of that happened. It became worse. Okay, in the same way that you could argue that the goal of Russian revolutionaries was to get rid of the bad, old, incompetent medieval czarist regime and to bring in a new, great, shining future. And it became even more authoritarian. And the crimes of the Imperial Russian regime pale in the significance of what would follow. In the same way, the crimes of Abdul Hamid pale to when you get to the Young Turks. But that wasn't necessarily the intention. But von Zebotendorf is a German businessman who's working in this period. And the whole point here is that the Ottoman Empire in this period is a hotbed of political intrigue. And all kinds of interesting things about it. The Young Turk Revolution is essentially a military coup, but it is plotted in Masonic lodges. I know, technically, Masonic lodges are never supposed to be involved in politics, but they are. The lodge meeting breaks up and then you plot the revolution. So, same group of people, but it's not technically. But yes, and there's the Macedonia Resorta Lodge in Thessaloniki was ground zero for plotting this military coup that was supposed to improve the empire. Botendorf is in one way or another mixed up in all of this, or at least he's an observer. Plus, he's initiated into the Masonic lodges. And interestingly enough, the fellow who initiates him into one of these Eastern lodges is a Jewish merchant by the name of Termudi, and who's also a Kabbalist, and involved. So Botendorf is very, very interested in the occult. He's initiated into Eastern Masonic lodges in a period when those same lodges are being used as a center for political intrigue. He also apparently is involved in gun running, which in revolutionary periods is, there's a lot of money to be made off of that. So he's connected to various dark businesses in a tumultuous time, with connections to politicized Freemasonry and the occult. Now, in the course of the First World War, he returns to Germany. He just shows up. And it would be my operative suspicion or theory that Botendorf was working for someone. I don't think he just pops up in Munich on his own accord. Why does he leave the Ottoman Empire and return to that place? Who's behind him? Well, maybe no one, but maybe someone, because he does seem to have money at his disposal. And he comes into Munich and he basically takes over this small sort of occult study group. Now, the interesting thing is that the Thule Society is really just a branch of another existing, what's called an Ariosophist order. A thing called the German Order, or the Germanenorden, which is centered in Berlin. But for some reason, he doesn't want his group to be connected by name with the Germanenorden. So Thule Society, Thule in this case is a reference to supposedly a mythical Arctic homeland of the Aryan race. And apparently they were all snow people who wandered out of the snow at some point. It's kind of like a frozen Atlantis. So I mentioned these people, the Ariosophists, which is, you have to practice saying that. So what are they? Well, they're a kind of racist Germanic offshoot of Theosophy. And I know I'm explaining one thing to explain something else, but there's no other way to do this. So Theosophy was 19th century, very popular and widely modeled occult belief that was founded by a Russian woman by the name of Helena Blavatsky. She was a medium, psychic. She supposedly got channelings from the Ascended Masters. The basic story they're all of the Ascended Masters, which are mystical beings that may or may not have once been human. They live inside the Himalayas, or they float among them on a cloud, and they guide the spiritual evolution of humanity. What Blavatsky did was to take Western esotericism and blend it with Hindu and Buddhist esotericism, which became very, very sexy in the West. Still is, Buddhism attracts a lot of people because, well, it's Buddhism. It's different, see? So, the Mahatmas, the Ascended Masters, were sending her messages, despite the fact that she was later proven pretty much to be a fraud and writing the letters herself. Nevertheless, people still went along with this doctrine, and it's been widely modified and copied since then. So an idea in Theosophy was that human spiritual evolution was tied to physical evolution. So in the case of Blavatsky never said that Aryans, white people, anything out this were superior. She talked about, the different root races, but it's just, her version of it is just total gobbledygook that seems to include everyone. I defy you to make much sense out of it. But in the early 20th century, there were different sort of, one of the things that became fashionable, not terribly popular. These are small movements with the idea that, well, Germany is a new upcoming country. And part of this, I think, was really trying to define who the Germans were. because, remember, the German Empire, Germany as a political state, doesn't come into existence until 1871. Prior to that, Germany was a geographic expression, a vague one, which described a large area in Central Europe where a lot of people who, wore leather shorts and or something like that, and spoke similar German dialects, were nominally Germans, but they might be Prussians or Bavarians or, they came in all sorts of varieties and religions. There was no German identity. Something very similar happened in Italy in the same period. I mean, there weren't Italians. There were Sardinians, and there were Romans, and there were Sicilians, Umbrians, spoke, again, dialects of a similar language, but had never lived, not since the Roman Empire, under a single state, and really didn't think of themselves as the same. So you have to create this artificial thing. You have to create Germans. There's now a Germany with an emperor, and so we're all going to be Germans. Well, exactly what is that? Much of it is an artificial creation. You have to decide upon some sort of standard dialect. Okay, we'll decide what that is. Often dialect that only a few people actually speak, and then it will be drilled into children's heads through state schooling programs. So I think this is the kind of milieu that it comes out of. People were trying to figure out what on earth Germans actually were, and the need for some sort of common identity. And, that leads to everything like Wagnerian opera, because Wagner wanted to create a German mythical music. So he went back and strip-mined old German myths and cobbled them together into a lot of people standing on stage singing. And that was his purpose. He was a nationalist. He was in many ways a kind of racialist nationalist. And this was his idea of trying to create, out of bits and pieces of the past, a newfangled form of German identity. So, on the more mystical end of this, you had the ideas that, well, Germany must have been created for some special purpose, because the Germans must be very special people, and we must have some sort of particular destiny, and then out of this, the direction this is heading, well, we're all part of some sort of master race, with some sort of ties to some sort of great civilization in the past. Call it Thule, call it whatever you want to be. They basically just invent things and try to attach those to the past. And so Ariosophy was the Aryanized version of Theosophy. And what this did was to take the idea that spiritual and physical evolution had led to the most advanced form of human beings, which were the Aryans, and the most advanced group of them were, of course, the Germans. And this attracted appeal. Keep in mind, again, this was not a mass movement. It was very much a fringe movement. Most people weren't aware of it and weren't particularly interested in it. But it had an appeal for those who already had a kind of esoteric bent in some form or another. And this is where things like the Germanen Order, the German Order, and their other groups, it was only one of many, sort of grew out of. And what it was that the Thule Society, as a branch, the Thule Gesellschaft, was supposed to do was to study this. It was an esoteric study group. And so people would get together and they'd talk about things, probably make more stuff up, and all sort of work around this idea of German Aryans as the most advanced type of human beings and all the wonderful things that the future would hold. And the fact that this was in the midst of a war in which Germany was again fighting, as they saw it, for its existence, heightened those kinds of tensions as well. So my suspicion, again, is that Zebotendorf, in terms of who was behind him, that he was essentially called back to Germany to work either for the Prussian political police or for some aspect of German intelligence or security to try to mobilize occultism or esotericism for the war effort. Because again, this is 1918. The war it's gone on way too long. within a few months, Germany will collapse, and it will collapse simply from the psychological exhaustion of the population.
So this is almost like to help the war effort with a kind of propaganda, a narrative that can strengthen the will of the German
It
people.
will strengthen the will of some people.
Some
I mean,
people.
you have to try to appeal to different aspects of this. But the mystical aspect is one of those things that can have a very powerful influence. And the idea is that if we can come up with some kind of mystical nationalism, maybe that's one to put it, a kind of mystical nationalism, that can be exploited for the workers. At this point, you're kind of grasping at straws. And this is a whole period when the Germans are marshaling the last of their forces to launch a series of offensives on the Western Front, the peace offensive, which will initially be successful but will ultimately fail and lead to a collapse in morale. But among the leadership of Germany, it was a recognition, it was that national morale was flagging. And one of the other things that was kind of raising its head was what had happened nearby the Russian Revolution, which had now brought the idea, which brought another solution to all of this, the idea of revolutionary Marxism. Here we need to remind ourselves as to where Marxism comes from. Not Russia, Germany. Where was the largest Marxist party? In Germany.
And Marx probably expected the revolution to begin in Germany.
Where else?
I mean, the Soviet Union is not very industrialized. Germany is, and so that's where it would probably...
Russia, 5% of the population is industrial workers. In Germany, 40% of the population is industrial. So if any place was like made for Marxism, it was Germany. I think that's why it caught on in East Germany so well, because it had kind of come home. And it was a local belief. It wasn't something imported by the Russians. It was a German invention. So the Thule Society, one of the things you can see in this is the Thule Society was particularly involved in sort of anti-Marxist or anti-Bolshevik agitation. They saw themselves, the Bolton source saw them as this whole movement. It was a counter to this. It was a kind of counter Marxist movement.
Can we sort of try to break that apart in a nuanced way? So it was a nationalist movement. The occult was part of the picture, occult racial theories. So there's a racial component, like the Aryan race. So it's not just the nation of Germany. And you take that and contrast it with Marxism. Did they also formulate that in racial terms? Did they formulate that in national versus global terms? Like, how do they see this?
Marxism formulates everything by class. Okay, people are categorized by class. You're either part of the proletariat or part of the bourgeoisie, or just, you're either part of the proletariat or just some sort of scum. Really? Needs to be swept into the dustbin of history. Mm-hmm. Only workers count. And that was what would take someone who was a nationalist, would sort of drive them crazy, because their ideas, we're trying to create a German people. We're trying to create a common German identity. But what the Marxists are doing is they're dividing Germans against each other by class. German workers hate the German bourgeoisie. German proletariat is opposed to German capitalists. We're all trying to fight this war together. So that was why Marxism, particularly in the form of Bolshevism, was seen as unpatriotic, and of course was opposed to the war as a whole. The idea that, parroting Lenin, was that the war was an imperialist war, and the only thing that was good that was going to come out of it is that the imperialist war, through all of the crises it was creating, would eventually lead to a class war, and that would be good because that would reconcile all of these things. But think of this, the two very different versions of this. The Bolshevist version, or let's just call it the Marxist version of Germany, was going to be a class society in which we're going to have some kind of civil upheaval, which will have Germans fighting Germans. Whereas the kind of mystical nationalism the almost kind of religious nationalism that Zebotendorf and the Thule Society had hitched its wagon to, held that Germans are all part of a single racial family, and that's what must be the most important thing. And that these can be different ways of trying to influence people. It comes down to a matter of political influence. So in a sense, I think that what Zebotendorf and the Thule Society were trying to do in Munich was to use this idea of mystical nationalism as a potential rallying point for some part of the population to oppose these other forces, to keep people fighting. The war is lost, though. The Kaiser abdicates, and essentially the socialists do take over. Things come very, very close to following the Russian model. And you even get the Russian version or take on the Bolsheviks, which are the Spartacists, who try and fail to seize power early on. But you do essentially end up with a socialist Germany. And that then leaves, in the aftermath of the war, the Thule Society is sort of the odd man out, although they're still very closely connected to the army. And here's one of the things that I find interesting. When you get into 1919, who is it that's paying Zebotendorf's bills? It's the army. The one thing the German army is absolutely determined to do is to preserve its social position and power. And they're perfectly willing to dump the Kaiser to do that. That's sort of this deal which is made. In November of 1918, Kaiser's abdication, the proclamation of a German republic, which, just had this guy declare it. It wasn't really planned. There's the Ebert-Groener Pact. Groener is the chief of staff, general staff at this point. Friedrich Ebert is the chief socialist politician, basically, and they make an agreement. And the agreement basically is that the army will support Ebert's government if Ebert supports the army. And particularly that means the continuation of the officer corps and the general staff in one form. The big deal is made. And that, of course, is what will eventually help defeat the Spartacist uprising.
Now, was the army doing the similar kinds of things that we've talked about with the intelligence agencies? This kind of same kind of trying to control the direction of
it's
power?
German intelligence in the First World War is obscure in many ways. There are lots of things that are going on. You've got Germany has a military intelligence service called Abteilung, or Section 3B. That's just plain military intelligence. They're constantly trying to collect military information, before the war about the weaponry and plans of the enemies, and then about what the operational plans were during the war. It doesn't really go much beyond that, though. The German Foreign Office runs a kind of political intelligence service. And that's the one which is much more involved in things like subsidizing subversion in Russia, which is one of the things that the Germans sign on to fairly early. Little diversion here. In 1915, there is a Russian revolutionary who's lived much of his life in Germany, who goes by the code name of Parvis, and he essentially comes to the Germans in Constantinople, interesting enough, in Turkey. He's hanging around there at the same time as here it is. So Parvis, or Alexander Helphand, to give his actual name, comes to him and he goes, look, there's a lot of revolutionaries in Russia, and there's a lot of mistrust with the regime. We think that the war will increase the contradictions in Russian society, and if you give me a lot of marks, I can finance this revolutionary activity, and through subversion, I can take Russia out of the war. The Germans are facing a two-front war. That sounds great. We'll use money in order to... But notice what they're doing. the German General Staff, a very conservative organization, not a bunch of revolutionaries, are going to finance revolution in an opposing country. They are going to finance revolutionary subversion to take Russia out of the war, which basically works. So that gives you another idea as to what the German military is willing to do. They're not revolutionaries, but they'll pay revolutionaries to subvert another regime. Now you've got the problem is that the revolutionary regime that your money helped bring to power is now threatening to extend into your country. So the whole question for the army and for others in Germany in 1919 is how to keep Germany from going Bolshevik, from in a sense being hoisted by your own petard. So the Thule Society, I don't think, is a huge part of this program, but it is a part of it. And it's all an effort to try to keep control, and that's why the army is financed. That's even why the army at some point then supplies them with its own propagandists. So the Thule Society begins to create, under Subottendorf's leadership, what he called the Rings of Thule. And these are satellite organizations that aren't the society itself, but they're kind of controlled and inspired by it. And one of those is something called the German Workers' Party. The German Workers' Party, again, is local. It's not large. It's not terribly influential. But what does it aspire to be? It aspires to be a party that will bring German workers away from the seductive influence of the Bolsheviks and into a more patriotic. And the way that I describe this is that it's not an anti-communist organization, it's a counter-communist organization. So you don't create something which completely opposes it, you create something which mimics it. Which is ultimately what the German Workers' Party will become, is the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Notice that term, socialist. And that is, in my view, what Nazism is from the beginning. It is a counter-communist movement.
And by the way, for people who don't know, the National Socialist German Workers' Party is also known as the Nazi Party. So how did this evolution happen from those that complicated little interplay? We should also say that a guy named Adolf Hitler is in the army at this time.
Yes.
Man.
Well, he's going to come into this because remember, said the army was going to supply its own propagandists to help the German Workers' Party and the Thule Society do their work. And the propagandist they supply them with is a man who the army trains, sends to classes to learn the art of public speaking and propaganda, and that fellow is Corporal Adolf Hitler.
So how does Adolf Hitler?
Well, been in the army during the war, a regular job that he never had. Kind of liked it. So you often get the view is that, well, at the end of the war, he joined millions of other German soldiers who didn't have jobs. No, he stays in the army. He stays in the army until 1921. He's on the army payroll at the very time in which he is held to set this up. What appears to have happened is this. Subottendorf had organized the Thule Society. That didn't have, that had tried to oppose. There's actually a brief period of time in which the communists actually take over Munich, the Bavarian Soviet Republic, which doesn't last very long, and eventually the army and volunteers put this down. While that's going on, by the way, Hitler is actually sitting in the barracks in Munich wearing a red armband because he is technically part of the soldiers who have gone over to the Bavarian Soviet Republic. He seems to have had flexible interests in this case. So once order is restored, so to speak, the army comes in and decide that, well, one of the things we need to have people who can lecture soldiers on patriotic topics. And so there is a particular captain by the name of Karl Meyer who sort of spots Hitler. He later describes him as like a stray dog looking for a master. Hitler has a knack for public speaking. Other soldiers will listen to him. Now, some people can do that, some people can't. Meyer decides that he's a good candidate for further training. So yes, they bring him in, they turn him into what's called a Wehmann, a kind of liaison man. He's an army propagandist. And then you've got this little outfit called the German Workers' Party. And essentially what happens is that Hitler is sent in to take over leadership of that, which is what happens. He shows up, he attends a meeting, there are like 50 people there. By the way, the topic of that, the first meeting he's at is how and why capitalism should be abolished. Okay, which is not what you might well expect. And because remember, the German Workers' Party is trying to cast itself as a counter-Bolshevism. So it's not saying that capitalism is great, which is important. Now, capitalism is evil. We agree upon that. We just agree it has to be destroyed from a nationalist point of view, as opposed from some sort of strange internationalist point of view. So Hitler is essentially, as I see it, sent in by the army as their trained man to assume leadership within this small party and to use it for the army's patriotic propaganda campaign. And he succeeds in doing so, even to the name change to the National Socialist or German Workers' Party. I mean, really, what sounds more red than that?
So the interesting thing here is, from where did anti-Semitism seep into this whole thing? It seems like the way they try to formulate counter-Marxism is by saying the problem with capitalism and the problem with Marxism is that it's really Judeo-capitalism and, quote, Judeo-Bolshevism. From where did that ideology seep in?
Well, where does anti-Semitism? Well, let's start with that term itself. A term which I have really grown increasingly to dislike because it doesn't actually say what it means. Anti-Semitism is anti-Jewism. That's all it is. I'm not sure whether there has ever existed a person who hated Jews, Arabs, and Maltese equally. Okay, that's kind of hard to imagine. I don't know. But that's technically what that would mean, because let's face it, most Semites are Arabs. So if you're an anti-Semite, then you don't seem to distinguish Jews from Arabs. It makes no sense. The origin of the term is invented by, guess what? An anti-Semite. Okay, a guy in the 1870s, a German journalist by the name of Wilhelm Marr, who is, wouldn't you know it, part Jewish himself, and who decides that you really need a better term than Judenhass, Jew hate, which was the term